Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and chapter 2 rather. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and chapter 2. With the political party conferences over for another year, we've probably all had our fair share of political speeches for a long time. And as you no doubt know, whatever you thought of those speeches, there was a lot of thought and planning went into those occasions. The content was carefully thought through, even if it wasn't quite your political taste. The choice of words was carefully selected so that the message was communicated well. The tone of voice was considered in advance so that it did not come across wrongly. The colour of the speaker's tie or dress and the colour of the stage background were chosen to coincide with their particular party colours. The location of the conference was deliberately chosen with a particular target audience in mind. That is why the SNP have their conference in Scotland and not in South Wales. Nothing about those speeches was left to chance, because they believe that content is only one of a huge number of factors that determines how a speech is received and whether it is a success or not. And in many ways, that's how it was in first century Corinth, and not only at the political party conference season, but throughout the whole year. Within first century Greek society, there was a fascination with public speaking. So much so that there were professional orators who went from place to place delivering eloquent philosophical speeches. And the more eloquent they were, the more impressive they were. The more eloquent they were, the wiser and the more powerful the speakers were considered to be. That was how first century Greek society ticked. And one of the temptations facing this Corinthian church was the temptation to buy into that and to adopt such worldly definitions of wisdom and power. And so in his desire to demonstrate that such worldly wisdom is at odds with true divine wisdom, Paul has drawn their attention to, firstly, the apparent foolishness in the eyes of the world, the apparent foolishness of the Christian gospel, verses 18 to 25 of chapter 1. And then he went on, as we discovered last week, from verse 26 through to 31, he went on to highlight the surprising makeup of the Christian church. It doesn't quite fit with how this world would go about things. And now in the opening 5 verses of chapter 2, he highlights the surprising way in which the Christian church communicates its Christian message. Because as far as Corinthian society was concerned, with its supposedly great wisdom, and as far as some within the Corinthian church were tempted to think, God was not only filling his church with the wrong sort of people, chapter 1 verses 26 to 31, he was also using the wrong sort of preachers to accomplish it, chapter 2 verses 1 to 5. And the first thing we learn as we come to study these verses is in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and there we see the focal point of our message. The focal point of our message. The travelling orators of first century Greek society, they spoke on all sorts of subjects, from philosophy to politics, from retail to religion. And therefore, if your message was of a religious nature, then it was assumed that you were competing with them for people's attention. And therefore, it was assumed that you had to play their game. What is more, you had to beat them at their game in the hope that the crowds would listen to you rather than them. And what was their game? Their game was to sound as eloquent and as clever and as slick and as professional as they possibly could. But what we hear Paul saying in these verses is that he didn't quite see it that way. When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. In other words, he didn't feel obliged to beat the orators at their game. In fact, he didn't even feel obliged to play their game. Instead, verse 2, he resolved to know nothing while he was with them except Jesus Christ and him crucified. You see, if he had allowed those other communicators of his day, if he had allowed them to set the agenda, then the one thing he would never have mentioned in his preaching was the death of Jesus Christ upon a cross. If he thought he was competing with them in their wisdom, the cross was the last thing he would have mentioned. Because as I've said on previous occasions, and as Paul has told us in chapter 1, verse 18, anything to do with the cross was considered to be absolute folly. And yet, says Paul in verse 2, that is precisely what I'm preaching on. I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, that does not mean that Paul spoke about nothing else other than the death of Jesus for a whole year and a half. That's not what it means. I'm sure he covered a huge spectrum of subjects during his 18 months of ministry in Corinth. For example, as he was setting up the church there, he must have taught the believers all sorts of basic doctrines, including, for example, the nature and the necessity of the local church, how it should function, and so on. It's hard to believe that when he left these young believers at the end of 18 months, it's hard to believe that they had heard nothing from him other than Jesus and his death upon the cross. But what it does more likely mean is that during his time in Corinth, he kept Jesus Christ and him crucified as the focal point of his ministry. He did so because, as we've heard him explain already in this letter, that is where true wisdom and true power is to be found. He did so because that is the very heart of the Christian gospel and the very focal point of the Bible's teaching. He did so because without the cross, and if you're not a Christian this morning, please hear this. Without the cross, there is no hope. Without the cross, there is no forgiveness. Without the cross, there is no salvation for sinners like you and me. And so Paul made it the focal point of his ministry. He did so because without hearing about the cross, people could never really understand the gospel. And therefore, people could never be converted. And therefore, if you're not a Christian this morning, then I would encourage you, amongst the many things I would love you to seriously think about, I would love you to think, first of all and most of all, about the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross. Why did it happen? What was Jesus accomplishing as he hung there on that cross? I would encourage you to think about that above everything else, because that is the focal point of the Bible's message. And it remained the focal point of Paul's preaching, in spite of enormous pressure to put the emphasis elsewhere. You see, although many of these believers in Corinth, although many of them were converted and the church was established under Paul's Christ-centered, cross-centered ministry, it seems that 3 or 4 years down the line, they are beginning to think about a change of emphasis. They look around themselves and they see how successful the local and the travelling orators are, and they are perhaps thinking to themselves, how are we ever going to compete with them in our attempts to get people's attention? How are we ever going to compete with them in our attempts to communicate our message? Perhaps the answer is we need to adopt their strategies, and we need to adopt their emphasis. We need to sound more eloquent, demonstrate the type of wisdom that their demonstration, which, if that means one thing, it means rowing back on the subject of the cross. It means cutting out any message of the cross. That way we will at least stand a chance of getting a hearing in Corinth. Does that sort of reasoning sound familiar? It may well do, because that is the temptation that the church has faced in every generation. The temptation of allowing the world to set the agenda with regards to what we preach and teach. There is the temptation of thinking that we have to go along with the world. And when it changes its ethos or its thinking, we have to change with it. Now, please note, I'm not saying that we should never review our presentation of the gospel in the light of changes in society. If you were with us a few weeks ago on Sunday evening, you may remember that I pointed out that Paul made a change to his presentation of the gospel, depending on who he was speaking to. He made a change on his presentation of the gospel between the biblically literate religious congregation of the synagogue in Athens and the biblically illiterate pagan audience of the Areopagus. And so, as our society becomes increasingly biblically illiterate, then that is something we may need to consider in terms of how we explain the big picture of the Bible, how we explain the storyline of the Bible. But that is different from allowing the world to set the agenda in terms of what we can and cannot preach. For example, just because the world thinks the concept of creation is bananas, that does not mean that we stop preaching and teaching about creation. Just because the majority of our society believe and live as if this life is all that there is, that does not mean that we stop preaching and teaching about heaven and hell. Just because our society believes that morality is relative, that does not mean that we stop preaching about sin and its frightening consequences. Just because men and women are obsessed with what they perceive to be the pressing needs of their present circumstances, that does not mean that we drop the ultimate need of salvation from the eternal consequences of sin from our sermons and only preach to felt needs instead. Just because the world finds the idea of an innocent man suffering and dying under the wrath of God, just because they find that offensive or abhorrent or even irrelevant, that does not mean that we stop preaching the cross and penal substitution. That was precisely the temptation the church in Corinth was facing. That was precisely the temptation that Paul would have faced and felt as he arrived in Corinth. To let them set the agenda. And yet, in spite of the temptation to do otherwise, he resolved, he determined to keep Christ and him crucified as the very focal point of his ministry. And many years later, so should we, because that is the focal point of God's message to a lost world. Secondly, moving on, verses 3 and 4, and there we see the weakness of the messengers. The weakness of the messengers. Now, if you want to divide this small paragraph up in some way, then it would appear that Paul is talking about the content of his ministry in verses 1 and 2, while in verses 3 and 4 he seems to be talking more about the form or manner of his ministry. And concerning the latter, he says this in verse 3, I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. And it may be that there were several reasons why he felt like that on his arrival in Corinth. Some of that may have been due to recent past experiences. For example, if you read Acts 17, you'll discover that in both Thessalonica and Berea, Paul had to leave both of those places in a hurry for security reasons. He had to get out quick. His very life was at stake. And although the situation in Athens seems to have been a little calmer, he never quite knew what to expect on his arrival in a new city, and not least in Corinth. Past hostility no doubt created an element of apprehension as he came to Corinth. And that's why the Lord's reassurance to him in Acts 18 verse 9 was, do not be afraid, keep speaking, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack you and harm you. But then it may also be that his sense of weakness and fear was partly due to first century Greece's fascination with eloquence and rhetoric and slick presentations, because he knew that he just wasn't like that. As he himself goes on to say in verse 4, my message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words. And therefore, compared with the orators of his day and their great success in drawing a crowd, he would have sensed his own weakness, his own inadequacy. Or it may be that his sense of weakness and fear was not so much in view of what the eloquent orators of his day were preaching, but more in view of what he himself has been commissioned to preach. The message he had been entrusted with was, verse 1, the testimony about God. His responsibility was to proclaim the work of God in the history of this world, and to proclaim the word of God to this lost world. And in the light of that enormous responsibility, he came to Corinth with a sense of weakness and fear. He came to Corinth trembling and in trepidation. During this past week, we've seen several of our Western leaders make their way to Jerusalem. Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak. But during the previous week, it wasn't them who made their way to Jerusalem. It was their representatives who made their way to Jerusalem. Firstly, James Cleverly, our Foreign Secretary, and then US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. They were sent by their respective superiors, Prime Minister and President. They were sent by their respective superiors to communicate their respective government's position on the current conflict in the Middle East. As you can imagine, that was an enormous responsibility. It's not like me being sent to Lidl with instructions to buy this, this and that, and run the risk of getting one of the three things wrong. At the end of the day, it's no big deal if I get one or two or even three of them wrong. We'll just have something different for dinner that night. Whereas I suspect that as James Cleverly and Antony Blinken sat on that plane and made their way to Jerusalem, they were conscious of the need to communicate faithfully what they had been told to say concerning that very serious situation. And that is similar in some ways to the situation Paul found himself in. He has been entrusted not with the words of a president, not with the words of a prime minister. He has been entrusted with the very words of God. He has been entrusted with the testimony of God. And as he contemplated delivering that testimony to the pagan, immoral people of Corinth, he was no doubt conscious of the enormous responsibility that it was. He was no doubt conscious of his own weakness and inadequacy to fulfill such a serious commission. In sharp contrast to the brimming confidence and self-reliance and self-sufficiency of the Greek orators, There was nothing trembling about them. They were brimming with confidence. In contrast to them, Paul came to Corinth in weakness and fear and with much trembling. Humanly speaking, he appeared to be so much weaker than they were. And that is why the Corinthian Christians were perhaps beginning to question whether he was the right man for the job. They were beginning to think that perhaps God was not only saving the wrong type of people, but perhaps God was using the wrong type of preacher. If only we had leaders, they would have thought to themselves. If only we had leaders that could match the world in their wisdom and in their eloquence, their professionalism and their slickness, then surely then the world would sit up and listen to our message, would it not? How many times has the Christian church been tempted to think like that over the past 2,000 years? Over the years, we've not only been tempted to let the world set the agenda regarding the content of our message, we have also been tempted to let the world set the agenda regarding the way in which we communicate that message. Now, please note, don't misunderstand me. That does not mean that we should communicate our message any old way we like on the grounds that communication is not important. That is not what it means. If we believe the Christian gospel is the best news this world could ever hear, then surely we ought to do all that we can to communicate it well. Surely we ought to do all that we can to communicate it as best as we can. We have a responsibility to communicate it clearly and as coherently and as compellingly as we possibly can. That is why Paul reasoned with people in the synagogue in Corinth. That is why he did all that he possibly could to try and persuade them of the truth of the gospel. There was nothing shoddy about Paul's presentation of the gospel message. And that is why the people of Lystra in Acts 14, that is why they likened him to Hermes, the Greek god of communication. But that is not the same as adopting the world's demands for slick, superstar, professional, polished, celebrity-like, gimmick-filled performances. For example, in his commentary on this passage, Don Carson says this, quote, he says, "We have become so performance-orientated that it is hard for us to see how compromised we really are. For example, prayer in church services now functions as the time to change the set in the sanctuary. The people of the congregation bow their heads and close their eyes, and when they look up a minute later, why, the singers are in place or the drama group is ready to perform. It's all so smooth. It is also profane. Nominally, we are in prayer together, addressing the King of Heaven, the Sovereign Lord. In reality, some of us are doing that, while others are rushing on tiptoes around the stage, and others, with their eyes closed, are busy wondering what new configuration will confront them when it's time to take a peep." End of quote. And what is true of the singing group or the drama group in some churches can also be true of the preaching in other churches. Believe me, if there is anything that is prone to become a performance, believe me, it's this that I'm doing. It's preaching. What rates as a good sermon or a powerful sermon is often not the clarity or faithfulness with which the Word of God is taught and applied, but the slickness of the sermon, the witty illustrations, and in some places the impressive and powerful rhetoric of the preacher's voice. Whether it be in preaching, or in the praise, or in the technology, what impresses our world is so often what impresses us as well. whereas Paul refused to allow this world to set the agenda, both with regards to the content of the message and with regards to how he communicated it. Just as he knew this world would dismiss the message of the gospel as weakness and foolishness, so he was willing, if need be, for them to dismiss its messengers as weak and foolish as well. That is the weakness of the messengers. Thirdly and finally, verses 4 and 5. The reason for message and messengers being what they are. The reason for message and messengers being what they are. Paul not only tells us what his ministry wasn't characterized by in verse 4, he also tells us what it was characterized by. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. Now, please note, Paul is not talking about the occasional sermon that seemed to go particularly well and that some of you might have described as an anointed sermon. And neither is he referring to his ministry in Corinth as opposed to his ministry in Athens or wherever. Yes, he is speaking specifically about his time in Corinth, but he could have said this exact same thing about his ministry everywhere he went. It too was accompanied by the Spirit's power, was it not? And the reason his ministry was accompanied by such power was because of the very nature of the message itself, which he proclaimed. Back in chapter 1, verse 18, he describes the message of the cross as being the power of God to us who believe. Now think about it. Is there any difference between the power of God in chapter 1, verse 18 and the Spirit's power in chapter 2, verse 5? I trust, having recently studied the subject of the Trinity, we would all say no. It's the same divine power. That is the divine power that resides in the God-given message of a crucified Christ. And it is a power which was present in the preaching of all who faithfully proclaimed Christ and him crucified in Corinth, whether it be Paul, Apollos, or Peter, or whoever. Don't forget, the context is division within the church. Chapter 1, verse 12. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, and so on. Now think about it. If Paul was now claiming in chapter 2, verse 4, that his ministry was accompanied by some additional power, in contrast to that of those other preachers of the gospel, then that would have done nothing to address the problem of division within the church, and instead that would only have fueled it and encouraged it and exacerbated it as people decided to follow Paul, an anointed preacher of the gospel, rather than all those others who were just faithful preachers of the gospel. No, the power he is referring to in chapter 2, verse 4, is the divine power that resides in the message of the cross, chapter 1, verse 18. And the particular way in which that divine power has demonstrated or manifested itself during Paul's time in Corinth was in the conversion of these Corinthian believers and the establishing of the Corinthian church. You see, in sharp contrast to the Greek orators, that's what he's comparing his ministry with. Not his ministry in comparison to the ministry of Peter or Paul or Apollos or any. He's comparing his ministry to that of the Greek orators. In comparison to them, whose power was limited to the cleverness and the persuasiveness of their presentation, Paul's preaching of a crucified Christ possessed a divine power. A divine power which transformed lives. A divine power which converted dead sinners into living saints. And the reason Paul deliberately avoided the eloquence and the superior wisdom of verse 1, and the reason he deliberately avoided the wisdom and persuasive words of verse 4 was because, verse 5, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. If Paul had adopted the tactics of the professional orators of the day, he could no doubt have attracted a crowd. He could even have got a response. But the question is, what were those people responding to? What were they responding to? What was it that had aroused their interest in the first place? And what was it that moved them to respond? The great danger was that they would have been moved by nothing other than the eloquence and the oratory. Such things may produce a momentary response, but they don't change lives, and they certainly don't change eternal destinies. And that is why 2,000 years later we have to be careful that in our presentation of the Christian gospel, we have to be careful that we don't emotionally or even intellectually manipulate people into making quick, rash decisions on the basis of our slick or our clever presentations. Yes, there is a place for Christian apologetics, in that it can often be effective in getting people to think. It can often be effective in getting people to realise the folly of their presuppositions. But if someone says that they have become a Christian on the basis of my brilliant argument, then what happens the next time that an atheist comes along with an argument that sounds even more cleverer than mine? It's not hard to know what happens. The very foundation of that person's faith is destroyed. Likewise, a rash, superficial response to the gospel based on an emotional story or a tear-jerking testimony is dangerous. In that once the emotional effects of the story have worn off, the person can be left with very little to cling on to. Now, that is not to say that there's not a place for illustration or testimonies, but for people to make a response, there ought to be a clear and thorough presentation of the gospel, including the message of the cross, so that people's faith is in the right person and in the right place, so that people's faith is in Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And that is why people must not be rushed or manipulated into making decisions for Christ. Although there ought to be an urgency to our evangelism, there must be an urgency to it. It's important, nevertheless, to leave room for the working of God's Spirit, for the working of God's Spirit in regeneration and conviction of sin and in conversion, so that when people do profess faith, their faith is resting on the power of God and not on the emotionally manipulative storytelling or our clever intellectual arguments. That is the reason, says Paul. That is the reason for keeping both the message and the means of communicating it according to God's wisdom and God's way, even if it's considered foolish and weak in the eyes of this world. It's so that when people do profess faith, their faith is resting on God and what He has done in the person of Jesus Christ. 3 things Paul has said concerning our communication of the gospel. The first is the focal point of our message. The second is the weakness of the messengers. And thirdly, the reason for message and messengers being as they are.